In 1986, a local diver was swimming off the coast of Japan, looking for hammerhead sharks. What he found instead would spark a debate that's still raging almost 40 years later. 25 meters below the surface sat something that shouldn't exist. A massive stepped pyramid, perfectly straight edges, right angles that looked carved by human hands. Scientists have been fighting about it ever since. One side says it's a 5,000-year-old lost city. The other side says it's just rocks. But here's what nobody's telling you. Both sides might be hiding something that changes everything. So, what exactly did this diver see that day that made experts lose their minds? His name was Kihachiro Aratake. He was a director of the local tourism association, just doing his job, scouting dive sites for tourists who wanted to see sharks. Instead, he stumbled onto what looks like Japan's version of the pyramids. The structure is enormous. We're talking 82 feet tall, 328 feet long, and 197 feet wide. It covers 45,000 square meters of ocean floor. But why would a pyramid be sitting at the bottom of the ocean off Japan? That's exactly what marine geologist Masaaki Kimura wanted to know. When he first heard about the discovery, even he thought it was probably natural. However, the moment he dove down and saw it with his own eyes, everything changed. He's now spent over 15 years diving at this site, measuring it, mapping it, documenting every inch. And with each dive, he becomes more convinced this was built by humans. So what makes him so certain when other scientists are calling him wrong? Kimura didn't just see a cool rock formation. He claims he found proof. Quarry marks in the stone, places where humans carved blocks out of the rock, rudimentary characters etched onto surfaces, rocks sculpted into the shapes of animals. He even describes one carving as resembling an underwater sphinx, says it looks like a Chinese or ancient Okinawan king. But wait, wouldn't these carvings prove it once and for all? You'd think so. However, there's a problem. He's been able to recover some of these artifacts in his laboratory. He says they suggest the culture came from the Asian continent. Yet when other geologists look at these same carvings, they see something completely different. So what do they see? Robert Schoch, a professor at Boston University who's also dived the site multiple times, looks at Kimura's animal sculptures and ancient writing and sees scratches, natural scratches on rock. He says Kimura is interpreting natural weathering patterns as human art, that the so-called drawings are just random marks made by water and time. Therefore, we have two experts, both diving the same site, both looking at the same rocks. How can they see such completely different things? Because this debate isn't really about the rocks anymore. It's about something deeper, something that makes both sides dig in their heels and refuse to budge. What could make scientists so stubborn about a pile of underwater stones? Here's where things get wild. Kimura's original theory, the one he published back in 1991, claimed this monument was part of Mu, the lost continent of Mu. You've heard of Atlantis, right? Mu is basically the Pacific Ocean's version, a mythical continent that supposedly sank beneath the waves in some massive catastrophe. According to the legend, Mu survivors scattered across Earth and founded all the great ancient civilizations. The Egyptians, the Maya, everyone. However, there's a problem with this theory, isn't there? Oh yeah. Historians have thoroughly discredited the Mu story. They traced it back to a shoddy mistranslation of ancient texts. There's zero historical evidence that Mu ever existed. So Kimura revised his estimate. In 2007, he told the Pacific Science Congress he now thinks the structure is only 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Still ancient, still man-made, but not quite Atlantis-level ancient. Why did he change his mind? Sea levels. When he thought it was 10,000 years old, the monument would have been above water, built on dry land, then submerged when sea levels rose. However, at 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, the sea was already at current levels. Therefore, he now says tectonic activity, earthquakes, must have caused the ground to sink, dragging the city down with it. Does that make more sense geologically? Actually, maybe, because here's what nobody disputes. This area is earthquake hell. The site sits off Yonaguni Island, which is part of Japan's Ryukyu archipelago. It's about 75 miles from Taiwan, right in the Pacific Ring of Fire. This means the area experiences constant earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and brutal typhoons. Here's a fact that'll blow your mind. April 1771. In April 1771, the world's largest recorded tsunami slammed into Yonaguni Island. The wave was over 131 feet tall. Think about that for a second. A 131-foot wall of water. That's taller than a 10-story building. So if ancient people did build this monument, could an earthquake have dragged it underwater? Toru Ochi, an associate professor of seismology at Kobe University, says absolutely. He's dived the site, he's touched the pyramid himself, and he's studied earthquakes his entire career. His conclusion? He's never seen tectonic activity create formations like this, either above or below water. He says what Kimura claims is not exaggerated, that it's easy to tell these weren't caused by earthquakes. But that directly contradicts what the geologists are saying, doesn't it? Exactly. Because while the seismologist says earthquakes couldn't make this, the geologists say earthquakes are precisely what did make it.
So how do geologists explain away something that looks so clearly man-made? Robert Schoch has a detailed answer. He says the rock is made of sandstone and mudstone, deposited about 20 million years ago during the Lower Miocene period. This type of sandstone, he explains, contains parallel bedding planes, natural layers that easily separate. It's also crisscrossed by vertical joints, natural fractures that run through the rock. Therefore, when earthquakes hit, the rock fractures along these joints, creating perfect 90-degree angles. The rectangular blocks you see, those are just pieces that broke off along natural seams. The steps? Horizontal platforms that fell into vertical positions when rock below them eroded away. What about the holes that Kimura says held wooden posts? Schoch says those were created by underwater eddies, swirling currents that scoured out depressions in the rock over thousands of years. And those straight lines of smaller holes? Marine creatures, boring into seams in the rock, following the path of least resistance. However, if this explanation is so obvious, why does Kimura reject it? Because Kimura has a counter-argument that's harder to dismiss.
Kimura doesn't just claim he found one structure, he says he's identified 15. 10 structures off Yonaguni itself, plus 5 more off the main island of Okinawa. In total, they cover an area of 984 feet by 492 feet. And these aren't random rocks. According to Kimura, they're organized. He claims he can identify the ruins of a castle, a triumphal arch, 5 temples, and at least 1 large stadium. All connected by roads and water channels, all partly shielded by what look like massive retaining walls. Could natural erosion really create something that looks like an organized city? That's what keeps this debate alive. Even Graham Hancock, a controversial historian who supports the artificial origin theory, admits that many individual features at Yonaguni appear in natural sandstone formations worldwide. But here's his argument. It's the concentration, the sheer number of peculiar formations packed into such a small area. What are the odds? He also points out something strange. On the flat areas of the formation, there's a relative absence of loose blocks. If these structures formed purely through natural erosion and fracturing, you'd expect rubble everywhere. So where are all the broken pieces? Schoch has an answer for that too. He notes the rocks are swept by strong currents. Those currents could have carried the debris away over thousands of years. However, there's another piece of evidence that's harder to explain away.
How do you even date an underwater rock formation? That's one of the biggest challenges in this whole mystery. Kimura tried using stalactites. He found underwater caves nearby that contain stalactites, mineral formations that grow incredibly slowly. By dating these stalactites, he estimated the caves were above water at least 5,000 years ago. Therefore, he argues, the monument must have been built before the caves sank. But didn't he revise that estimate? Yes, he now points to structures sitting on the nearby coast that look similar to the underwater formations. When archaeologists tested charcoal from those land structures, it dated to 1,600 years ago. So Kimura suggests this as possible evidence of ancient human inhabitants in the area. However, here's the critical problem with all this: no artifacts. Pottery doesn't survive long on the ocean floor, neither does wood. Without artifacts, you can't prove humans were there. Is there any direct evidence of human involvement? Kimura says yes. He's interested in a relief at the site that appears to be painted. It resembles a cow, he claims. He wants to determine the makeup of the paint, if it's paint, because that would be the smoking gun. Paint would prove human involvement beyond any doubt. However, as of now, that analysis hasn't been completed. Therefore, after decades of research, we still don't have definitive proof either way. Here's what might be the strangest part of this entire story. Neither the Japanese Agency for Cultural Affairs nor the government of Okinawa Prefecture recognize the Yonaguni Monument as an important cultural artifact. Neither government agency has carried out research or preservation work on the site. Why would the government ignore something that could be a 5,000-year-old lost city? The official stance seems to be, it's just rocks. Until proven otherwise, it's not worth government resources. This means the site has no special protection. Anyone who wants to can dive down and explore it themselves. And they do. The Yonaguni Monument has become a popular diving attraction, despite the area's notoriously strong currents. Even the famous freediver Jacques Mayol visited and wrote a book about his dives there. However, if Kimura is right and this is an ancient city, isn't it at risk? Absolutely. Without protection, the site could be damaged by careless divers, erosion, or even deliberate artifact hunting. But there might be a shift coming. Kimura mentioned that Okinawa's new governor and officials from UNESCO have recently expressed interest in verifying the site. So after all these years, could we finally get an official investigation? Maybe. However, there's a deeper question we need to ask. What if both sides are partially right? Think about it. What if the formation started as a natural structure, one of those peculiar geological accidents, and then ancient people discovered it and modified it, added carvings, built platforms on top, used it as a foundation? That would explain why geologists see natural fracture patterns, while Kimura sees evidence of human tools, because both things could be true. Here's what we know for certain. The rock is 20 million years old. The formation sits in an earthquake zone, and something about its appearance has convinced a marine geologist to dedicate 15 years of his life to studying it. Robert Schoch, the main critic, admits that if he hadn't seen the structures for himself, he might be skeptical of their natural origin too. So maybe the real lesson here isn't about who's right. Maybe it's about how easy it is to look at the same evidence and see completely different stories, how our assumptions shape what we're willing to believe. The Yonaguni Monument sits 25 meters below the surface, waiting for someone to prove once and for all what it really is. Until then, it remains one of the most controversial underwater structures on Earth, a mystery that might never be solved. Or maybe it's already been solved, and we just don't want to accept the answer.